I will share my screen. Tonight is March 12th, ECS 110. We're on day 9 of 13, so I think only 4 left. We'll talk tonight about gender and a little bit about sexual diversity, and we'll continue with this topic into next week and a little bit into week 11 as well. So we have a couple of assignment reminders. We don't have any commenting on blog posts this week, but you do have your writing the self-analysis, looking for normative narratives assignment that's due, which takes up your self-stories in particular ways, looking for similarities and differences. And I talked about this a little bit last class, sort of gave an introduction. And I said I would take questions tonight. Are there questions that you want to pose? Anyone? No questions?
Oh, yes, I have a question.
Okay, go for it.
I was reading, the description of it, and then I was going over my notes from last class, and my notes from last class, it seemed like you said write 1 paragraph. I wrote down 1 quote from my story, 1 quote from another story, and then 1 quote from a second story. And then when I read about the description, it looked like it was like 6 paragraphs. Was I missing something, or is it?
I think you misunderstood. So
yes.
I did talk about including quotes from all the stories. Part 1 should be a few paragraphs, and then part 2 another couple paragraphs.
I must have only listened to 1 part.
Yeah, so the idea is to use the quotes together. So I don't want you saying like, my story said this, and here's a couple quotes from my story, and then Avery's story said this, and here's a couple quotes from Avery's story, and then Christina said this, and on and on. I don't want you to separate them like that. I want you to look at your story with 2 others in order to see what the normative narrative is, and then illustrate using quotes together. So you might use a quote from your own and a quote from Avery's and a quote with Christina's in the same paragraph in order to say something about gender or whatever topic it is that you signed up for. So Jacqueline, you signed up for?
Being Canadian.
Being Canadian, yeah. So probably what you would look for there is those normative stories about like wilderness, for example, like doing things in a Canadian way, or like 1 story was about a football game, 1 story was about fireworks, if I recall these off the top of my head. And so you might look at the ways that those reproduce colonization and leave out treaties, if that makes sense. So then you use a 4th story from whoever, if necessary, to look for differences in the ways that being Canadian or race and racism or classism or gender, whichever one you signed up for, is perhaps beyond that stereotypical normative narrative.
Okay.
Does that
Thank you for it's super helpful. Yes, thank you very much.
Are there any other points for clarification that you all would need from me tonight?
Just so the quotes just help you your argument to state how it is like a normative, right?
Normative narrative, yeah. So you're looking for a particular normative narrative about whatever topic you signed up for, and you can use any story from the whole class to help you do that. So if you're looking at race and racism, a lot of the stories don't talk about whiteness. Like whiteness is hidden. Or some of them talk about how it seems awkward for when kids notice race. And so the normative narrative in those stories is that we're taught to be colorblind when we have those reactions as parents, to say like, don't talk about race, for example. So you use the 3 stories in order to illustrate how that operates in everyday moments. So you're not picking on the stories by saying like, this story showed that this person was bad or wrong or like silly or they shouldn't have done that. It's more so to look for how normative narratives show up in our everyday lives, often without us even noticing. So this course is asking us to start to notice. And we did that in one way through these self-stories. More? Any others? Okay. Again, you're always welcome to email me, or if you have questions that you think that a peer might be able to help you, just post something on the Google community. So one of the other assignment reminders that I wanted to talk about was the Mythbusters piece, and I hope you're all busily working away together in your groups to take up the topic that you proposed in a creative way and to attempt to disrupt those myths, those normative narratives that you identified. So again, let me know if you need support or if there are any troubles there. Hopefully you're starting to put together the organization of the story and perhaps getting some footage ready, and try not to leave that all until the last week. So continue to work on that with your group this week. Are there any Mythbuster questions? Like general questions that might be of interest to the whole group? Reading response folks for number 3 are in 2 weeks, and you can start working on that at any time. The prompt is around sexism as well, / gender in the context of colonization. And so you can get started on that. Carter, Christina, Sean, Jana, Emily, Elle, and Bree, whenever it makes sense for you to get started. So you don't have to wait until right before it's due. It's posted for you. So those are the upcoming things that we have going on in the course at this time. Today, we're going to take up the idea of gender. And gender is an idea. So we'll talk about what is gender as an idea, and what this thing called the gender binary is, and why it's a myth. We'll think about gender normative narratives. Heteronormativity is another term that's often used to describe gender normative narratives, especially as related to sexual orientation and sexual diversity. We'll take up sexism a little bit in the context of feminism, and we'll think through gender and sexual diversity. We'll begin to do that and continue next week. Throughout, you might consider how we contribute to undoing this idea of gender. So we're going to talk about gender as a construction, just like race is a construction, is a concept that we've made up all together as a society. And there are particular prejudices and points of discrimination coded in the ways that we interact with one another in relation to gender. So we'll start with this warm-up. What do your clothes say about you? So I want you to consider what you're wearing right now in your house, or what you wore today if you were out and about doing things today. And I'll put you into breakout groups, and I want you to think about how you're dressed, like I don't mean a dress, but how you're dressed relates to a particular kind of performance of your gender or not. I'll just give you a few minutes. It's a pretty straightforward question. Maybe share what you're wearing with your small group and why you think that is a particular kind of performance of gender. Any questions? Okay, so we're all back. Maybe group one can begin us off. So give us an example maybe of something that someone from your group was wearing and what you think about that in terms of performing gender.
Okay, so we were, I think, group one.
Mm-hmm.
And we had like three just, I don't know if they're Norman Airburns or whatever, but like I'm wearing a baseball hat. And so the understanding that like all guys like sports. And like Danica had earrings in her ears. And like Allie had a pink track jacket kind of to kind of show gender differences. But then we also got into discussion about how a lot of comfy clothes like can be general like neutral, like sweatpants and hoodie or jeans and a hoodie. So we just kind of got into that kind of line. But most of us were wearing pretty comfy clothes.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Scott. Breakout room 2. Carmel, Carter, Dale, Jacqueline, or Emily H.
Sorry, that's me. I just didn't know what number we were.
That's okay.
We talked about everybody was kind of wearing comfy clothing, just kind of exactly like Scott just covered. So then we kind of got on different topics about what people would wear if we weren't just at class right now, on the day-to-day kind of thing. So I had said in my job, I wear dresses to work. I always wear dresses to work. And we discussed about how that could be considered formal dress for a female. Everybody else, the jobs that they're in allow them to dress relatively casual, so they can wear jeans and a t-shirt or jeans and a sweater, just no rips, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Breakout room 3, do you have anything to add? Austin, Drew, Jess, or Meg?
We, again, like we talked, like most people were wearing just comfy clothes. But myself personally, like I today wore leggings and like a tighter t-shirt, and just like I felt that like what I wore, like it like to be blunt, like had cleavage, and so like I felt like that, like you assume that I am comfortable with me being as identifying as a female.
Good, thanks, Jess. Breakout room 4, Bree, Robin, Sean, or Susie. Anything from you guys?
Sorry, I was having problems with my computer. Basically, we are the same as everybody else. Everybody's dressed pretty comfortably. One person was wearing pink sweatpants. Sean was wearing a sports t-shirt, so pretty much what Brandon said about, guys like sports. I'm wearing a shirt that has the slit up at the top, which functions absolutely no reason at all, air conditioning. But what we did discuss is how a lot of women's clothing fit, a woman's shape. So, for example, this shirt may fit in a certain way to accommodate a woman where it wouldn't fit a man in the chest area properly.
Mm-hmm. We could also think about if we encountered one of our friends who we know identifies as a man wearing the shirt that Robin was wearing with the slit on the shoulder, what kind of reaction you might have. Or
we actually did talk about that, and Sean just didn't think he'd be comfortable wearing it.
Yeah. And so this is how we come to a particular understanding about what's acceptable when we do gender, when we perform gender. So the last breakout room, I'll give you also a little bit of time to share if there's anything you want to share. Brandon, Christina, Emily, or Jana.
Okay, so our group discovered that one of our members wore a scrunchie, and we decided that was gender specific towards females, and she was a female. And then one member was wearing a bandana, which also is gender specific towards females, and she was a female, or she identifies as a female. And I was wearing dress pants and a dress shirt, which is, I guess, getting to the 1960s, is more, gender specific towards males. So I guess in a way, those are the three that we found.
Thanks, Brandon. We can also ask questions about our accessories. So even my glasses, I got new glasses a couple weeks ago, and my other ones were also pretty gender specific. They had little red lines on the top. So you can ask yourself questions about your accessories. Someone mentioned earrings, or I wear a nose ring with like a little sparkle jewel sometimes. How often do we see men with nose rings like that? So all of these things are signals to others to perceive us in particular ways. So I'm going to show you a couple of photos of my nieces and nephews from a couple of years ago to try and have you pick up on their signals, perhaps. For us to notice that we have prejudice about gender, which just means that we have assumptions that we make about who people are based on how they do gender or perform their gender. So do you think that this relative of mine identifies as a boy or a girl? Anyone, you can just, first thoughts, and tell us why.
I'm gonna say girl. I don't know why, it's just the blonde and I just feel it, but at the same time, I don't know, my little boy has very long hair, so it's tricky, but I felt girl right away, just because I wanted to defeat the obvious.
Yeah, okay. So what do you mean defeat the obvious?
Like the pajamas,
There's
dark
another
blue,
signal.
spaceman, that
Right.
was, right.
As if for some reason girls wouldn't want to wear space pajamas, or
Right.
like it's gray and blue and orange, like that those colors wouldn't be agreeable for a girl. Austin in the chat says girl because of long hair. Susie's son says girl, but she says boy. And so you might just consider all of those signals and then what you perceive this person to be. This was a few years ago, and they came to learn that the long hair did signal girl because of reactions that they would get in public, and also from their older brother, who started telling them to get a haircut, as well as their grandparents would say things, and other relatives would be like, when saying to my sister and her husband, when are you gonna get Bristol's haircut? So Bristol is 6 now, and he obviously identifies as a boy. And even when this picture was taken a few years ago, he identified as a boy then too, even with the long hair. He wasn't questioning even in his youthful age. So I just want you to remember that we're looking for signals here. So here's another picture. So there's Bristol again on the left, on the very left-hand side. This was at a birthday party, and it was a Mario-themed birthday party. These are my nieces and nephews, some of them. And the fellow in the middle, that's Bristol's brother, who taught him that he needed to get a haircut, as well as his cousins on the right and the left. And then what about the girl on the very, very right with the pink stripy shirt? She was offered a mustache as well in the loot bag, but refused to wear it. Why do you think?
Probably hasn't seen many girls with mustaches. It's a boy thing.
Yeah, it's a boy thing. But why couldn't she even just let go a little bit and have a bit of fun and pretend to be Mario? She was maybe 8 there or so, 7 or 8.
The person was socially conditioned to think otherwise.
Yeah, that girls don't have fun in that way. Yeah, we're socially taught that that's not something that a girl should do. Even though all of her aunts and her mom were like, try on the mustache, it's no big deal, it's just for fun. Yeah, it's not ladylike. So some of these things were taken up also in your self stories. Susie in the chat says girls just want to be Princess Peach. So notice how even those games put gender into particular boxes. Like Princess Peach has to wear that princess outfit with blonde hair and a crown. Goes back to this photo. Boys have to be tough, girls have to be sweet. So we can think about ideas like, is this ladylike, or are you acting like a boy right now? What does it mean to act like a boy or act like a girl? This is how gender is constructed. It's an idea that's made up in society. So we build gender into storylines. We've talked about subject positions or positionalities or social positions. It's how we make sense of ourselves as a gendered being. So we have some symbols up at the top right of this slide, and these are some gender symbols, and two of them for sure maybe make sense easily. The blue and the pink one. Yeah, and then what about the other? The other more strange rainbow symbol. How come that doesn't make as much sense? Just consider what we think about the idea of making sense of ourselves. And if someone doesn't fit into the boy or the girl category, that means that they don't make sense. Think about that storyline for a minute. The other normative narrative that happens around gender is that gender is assumed to be the same thing as biological sex, or like your genitalia, your physical attributes, your body. And that is a myth. So sex does not equal gender. It's not the same thing. Again, sex is biological. It's those primary characteristics on your body, and it also has secondary characteristics because of particular kinds of hormone impacts. And so we know what these are already. We know how to look at a body and say to ourselves, that signals girl or boy. So gender is socially constructed based on some of these secondary characteristics, as well as how we present ourselves, how we perform gender. It has multiple and contested meanings, which implies that it's not so straightforward as just girl or boy. Gender expression and identification is actually, instead of just a truth, it is an embodied experience. It can't be just reduced into understanding what's underneath of our clothes. So sex does not equal gender. So we say that gender is a construction. It's a process of coming to understand ourselves within these categories. So think about how you've come to know yourself as gender. Sorry, I got this mixed up. It's actually our self-story number 4, not 3. Think about how it begins early. For instance, gender reveal parties are somewhat popular these days, and that even begins before a baby is born. This construction about what girls or boys should wear, what colors the baby's room should be, or what color the gift should be that we get, or consider if you found yourself asking, as I have in the past, what are you having? Are you going to find out what you're having? What you're really asking there is whether or not that baby has a penis. And so you might wonder, why do we need to know that? Can we just suspend that for a while and ask ourselves, why is that so important? So this construction is coded into our daily lives in ways that are intricate, and it's hard for us to see. So this is just a really short video that will illustrate this a little bit further.
Are you a boy or a girl? Are you a girl or are you not? Are you a girl or are you not? So what the hell are you? A man or a woman? There is nothing natural about gender identity. We don't just pop out of the womb with our gender identities imprinted in our genes. It's part of a process whereby we learn to take on certain attributes that we think are appropriate to our understanding of ourselves in gender terms. Therefore, we have to analyze how the society constructs the categories within which we fit.
So it's important for us to recognize that these constructions happen in multiple ways with different media. This doesn't mean that gender is not real. It just doesn't mean that it's exactly biological. It does mean that gender is located within discourses, within stories that construct ideas of masculinity and femininity in often unequal ways. So we don't have to simply just say, well, that's just the way it is. We can realize that this construction has been made up, and therefore it can be questioned and potentially undone, or at least disrupted a little bit. So Gender 101, let's talk about some of these terms. So either in the chat, or if you'd want to aloud answer your idea of, or your understanding of the gender binary. What is a gender binary? What does binary mean to you?
Is that referring to male and female?
Yep, exactly. It's as simple as that. We talked about some other binaries or dualisms earlier on in the course, things like rich, poor, white, black, good, bad, all of those dualisms construct this simple view of the world as one or the other. So yes, in fact, the gender binary is this simplistic view that it's either just female or male, or woman or man, into these two distinct categories. What about trans or transgender? What does trans mean?
Transitioning?
Pardon me, Meg?
Transitioning or transition?
What does transitioning mean to you? What is your understanding of that?
Making a change.
Making a change. We don't have to talk about bodily characteristics right now. We're talking about gender, right? Sex is not the same thing as gender. So if you're transitioning, what are you transitioning from or to?
From a certain sex to another?
Change the wording there. It's really close.
Boy to girl?
Yeah, boy or girl. So boy or girl, or woman or man. So from one gender to the other. When you say one sex to the other, that refers to surgery, etc. And trans or transitioning doesn't necessarily imply surgery.
Good to know.
Yeah. So we practice these words, these terms. If we think about this definition, this explanation, an umbrella term applied to those whose gender identity is not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth, we can then think about the people like myself. I was assigned girl at birth and continue to identify as woman. And so what do we call people who identify how they were assigned at birth? Yes, good, Jess, cis. So cisgender, for simplicity's sake, as someone who's not transgender, but we would more accurately say that it's how they identify based on how they were assigned. How about gender queer? Has anyone heard this term before? Or even just the term queer. which often is used in derogatory ways historically, but also in present times. And the queer community has taken back the word so that it's not necessarily a derogatory term. It can mean gay, but not necessarily. So it does have connections to sexuality, but it doesn't necessarily have to not the norm. So the norm here is also perhaps problematic. Referring to the gender binary as a normative narrative is useful, but when we attempt to say like you're normal if you identify as a girl and were assigned as a girl, or vice versa, identify as a boy and were assigned at birth as a boy, if we call that normal and everyone else non-normal, that's a problem, right? So Jess, thanks for putting that out there, and more accurately we would say it's not part of the normative narrative. Yes, Danica helps out there. So we don't follow those normative narratives of performativity of gender. So in terms of genderqueer specifically, it's those who don't identify within the binary even. So you might have heard other terms like gender fluid, gender neutral, and these are part of the genderqueer category, if you need to call it a category. And often it's best that individuals would identify with those terms themselves. So I'm not going to go up to someone and say like, oh, I can't figure out what you are, so that means that you're genderqueer. Yes, non-binary is another term that is sometimes used in the context of genderqueer. We've talked about transitioning. That process of changing gender, again, it has nothing to do with sexual characteristics or features. So the gender binary talks about particular categories with man and woman. Male is actually a term that more specifically refers to genitalia and biological features, and same with female. So male and female, I don't use for the purposes of this course as gender descriptor words. So if you are doing, if you're doing your writing the self-analysis on the topic of gender, be careful here. Don't use male, female to talk about gender. Those terms specifically relate to sexual traits. So instead, we use words like boy or man, masculine, and then we have these other features that go along with the gender binary. Can you yell some of them out, like strong? What are some other assumptions that we make about men and boys? That they're supposed to be what?
Boys are supposed to be like roughhousing.
Yep, more. What are some more? Either in the chat or aloud. Yeah, can't cry. No tears. Somehow macho, pretty tough, very good. Assertive, good. Yeah, they got to make the money. All of these are major stereotypes of or expectations of boys and men. They need to be in charge. So this word rational is kind of also like logical, which goes along with emotionalists. We also have come to know that the gender binary is relates to men having a particular kind of culture, where women is more about nurture and nature and the body. So men is associated with mind, like being in charge as the leader, making money, being assertive. They're active workers and they have a particular kind of dominance. So if we contrast this story with the expectations of what it means to be a girl or a woman, again, female is not a gender term. It's a term about the biological features of a woman's body. We can contrast with the term feminine, which is a gender term. And then we have all of these on the opposite end of the spectrum, assumptions about women, that we're weak, that we're irrational. Like if I somehow was triggered to cry in the middle of this class tonight, It might be blamed on my femininity. She's emotional, she's a woman. Like, that's expected, you know, with the roll of the eyes. Yeah, we're passive. We're more about, there's an assumption that we're more about our bodies because of the connections to birth and babies and menstruation. Very good. Also something that we're not really supposed to talk about. We have to be dainty and shy and passive. We're the mother figure, and there's storylines about being submissive that are connected with various religions as well. So it's good to remember that we talked about intersectionality last class, and the gender binary doesn't happen all on its own. It's part of the rest of our social positions as well. So, gender, a review. It's socially constructed. It's made up as stories that we tell about ourselves and others, and sometimes this is in the form of stereotypes around what it means to have a male body or a female body, and then it's assumed to be a boy, or we are assumed to either be a boy or a girl, one or the other. In terms of the gender binary myth, the normative narrative is that the man has particular privileges, a dominant subject position, and that has become structural or systematic. This results in hypermasculinity and sexism, and it seeks conformity. It makes boys and men have to be those things that we listed in the gender binary list, as well as perceives women to be all of the things that we listed in the women's side. So we are regulated and regulate ourselves and others with various social cues like dress codes, things like sit like a lady. Many of you talked about that in your self-story number 4, how you learn to be a boy or learn to be a girl. So sometimes this regulation has been called the gender police. You might have heard of that before. And often this happens in subtle ways as well, like people saying you should get a haircut because boys don't have long hair. We've talked about the gender reveal party, right? What if to disrupt the gender reveal party, we chose colors that were more neutral? Settle in. It's time for Gender Theory 101. Maybe even bring slides. You know, many of you have kids, so think about your own experience with others asking you about the gender of your child, and even your own desire to know if you're having a girl or a boy and where that comes from. This comes from the gender binary. So the gender binary creates sexism as gender-based discrimination, and gender-based discrimination can happen to men, but sexism can't happen to men. Remember we talked about the isms? What does the ism refer to? Why can't men be recipients of sexism?
Because it's systematic, and therefore
Yes.
males hold a lot of privilege.
Yes, very good. It's because of patriarchy. It's because of the way that our society is organized to privilege men over women, often in subtle ways, so that it's hard to see. So can women be sexist? Is there such a thing as reverse sexism? If sexism is systemic, can an individual woman be sexist?
No, but they can be prejudiced.
Yes, they can act in discriminatory ways based on someone's gender, but they cannot be sexist. They don't contribute to sexism, but they can still discriminate based on gender. So we need to remember that the ism is institutional oppression, is systematic, it's structural oppression of the group of women by a group of the larger population of men, but not individuals necessarily. It's the idea that men would hold up patriarchy as the system of privilege. So, or this belief that men are inherently superior to women. This results in a difference of power between men and women, and that's what we would call sexism, is the difference of power. So sexism is like saying gender discrimination plus power. So we can ask questions like this to help us understand sexism a little bit better. What would you do if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew? And I want you to consider, is this question sexist? You're going to do this in breakout rooms in a minute. And so then if you say yes or no, I want you to elaborate. There's also a document that some of you maybe have seen already in the weekly plans, and I'll put it in the chat in a minute. I want you to think about what steps you perhaps take on a daily or weekly basis to prevent yourself from being sexually assaulted. And there's a chart. Men, those of you who identify as men, I would like you to write your responses in the left-hand side, and those of you who identify as women, write your responses on the right-hand side. And then we'll come back and have a little conversation about it. So the document looks like this. Someone's already said none that I know of, and if that's different for someone else, you can elaborate below. I'm just going to quickly put the link in the chat to everyone. And I will open your breakout rooms and you can get started. So here are the questions in the weekly plans under March 12th. They're listed for you. Is this question sexist, etc.? Please go through that list in your breakout rooms. Okay, so we're all back. Let's start with this question. This is not a sexist question, I would argue. Who would like to comment on why it's important to consider this question in the context of sexism? What did you talk about in terms of this question and thinking about sexism? Do we have any volunteers, or do I need to pick a room?
We just talked about in my group, in number 2, we just talked about how it could be considered like sexist and sexism if the women are like gaining something after 9 p.m. But we don't have enough like details and like to make an appropriate like answer.
So we make an assumption that all is the same as it always has been. And the question is trying to tease out it's sort of like the next question, the ways that women protect themselves from sexual assault in public spaces, especially at night. So the idea with this question is that the gender binary talks about men being dominant, being tough, being aggressive, and that women need to submit to men. And so that gender binary has contributed to the idea that men historically, but also continue to, and I'm not talking about individuals, right? I'm not saying that Scott and Brandon and Austin and Sean, did I miss anyone in class who identify as men?
Me.
Sorry,
Me.
Carter. Thank you. Trying to go through the class list in my head. Thanks, Carter. I'm not saying that these folks in our class are sexual predators and going out after 9 p.m. and assaulting women. That's not what this question is talking about. What it's having us consider are the ways in which women, and especially women of color, have to learn or are told that they have to learn particular ways to be safe at night. So the reason I would argue that this isn't a sexist question is because it speaks to the systemic way that the gender binary allows men as a group, not as individuals, as a group, to potentially allow fear and feelings of being uncomfortable in spaces like parking lots, on streets at nights, in certain areas of the city, for women to feel unsafe in those spaces because of an assumption that it's okay for men to do whatever it is that they'll do. So it's not a sexist question. Instead, it's a question that has us ask how sexism continues to operate in our society. Let's go on to the next question, which is very similar. What steps do we take on a daily basis to prevent ourselves from being sexually assaulted? So if we look at our list, they are different kinds of lists. So the men talked about like being careful or avoiding girls that maybe are harassing, or we might say that they're too forward, or this part is really important. If a man is sexually assaulted, it's almost like no one will believe them. It's viewed as impossible, and it's not impossible. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying that structurally, women are taught that we aren't supposed to walk alone after dark, that we don't set down our drinks, that we have to keep our outside lights on, that we have to carry a beep or a whistle, or carry our keys in a certain way, or make sure that we have 911 setting in a certain way. And men don't do those same things. So we're not saying that men can't be sexually assaulted or harassed, but that women's experience of assault and sexual harassment as a group, not as individuals, but as a group, is more intense than men as a group. And that's part of the point here, is that we need to understand sexism as a larger construction of society, not from an individual perspective. So these lists matter. This activity is taken from the reading that I posted, and it's normal that the list for women is much longer than the list for men. And so we want to think about what this does. So what's still missing in these lists? Again, we're not assuming that men do not experience or cannot experience forms of assault or sexual harassment, but that we're looking at how the group of women experience it in more extreme ways. So what's missing here when we have men on one side, women on the other? This still reproduces the gender binary. Go ahead. Who's missing?
Sorry.
Danica, go ahead.
That actually doesn't answer your question. I thought you were asking something else. Sorry.
Oh, what were you going to say? It's fine.
Well, we just, in our group, we talked about, like, Scott made the comment that he wished that there were more questions about what can men do to help, like, to help fight against this sexual assault and this sexism that's going on, rather than
keeping it so separate, like what can women do to avoid being assaulted and what can men do to avoid being assaulted. We talked about why can't we work together, and also in the song that is in the weekly plans, I was reading through the comments that people were posting, and most of them, almost all of them that I read, were very negative and very defensive. And
For the woman?
Sorry, what did you?
Negative and defensive how? Like, who's being defensive about what?
Men mostly were being defensive, saying that she was trying to say that all men have committed rape, or all men whatever, act in the same way. And so we just thought that it was very sad that we're, like, instead of taking the time to work together and figure out solutions to these problems, we it's kind of like the white fragility issue, but not the same thing. But like, we just argue that people, I don't know.
Yes, for sure. It's the fragility of men, we could say, and men as a group, right? Not as an individual. So we can ask questions like, how can movements like Me Too disrupt systemic sexism if men are like presenting all these common rebuttals about movements like Me Too? So Matt Damon was one of them who talked about how the Me Too movement was affecting men in Hollywood and men who have not assaulted women. So all of these common rebuttals get really complex. Or for another example, International Women's Day just happened on Friday, which was March 8th. And so a big common rebuttal that we hear often on International Women's Day or during that time is, what about International Men's Day? Or is there a Men's Day? And so this tries to recenter men, and often the response to that, or a response that I've heard women use, is every day is Men's Day, patriarchy is every day, and also there is an International Men's Day, and it's in November. It's just talked about differently. And so in response to Scott's prompt, like, what can men do in order to work together with women, what men can do and what women can do is disrupt hypermasculinity, disrupt the idea that men need to be tough, without emotion, only rational. They need to be dominant and take care of their women. So feminism is not just all about girls, and neither are some of these movements that try to disrupt sexism. You've heard phrases like man up, and there are movements that are started by men and attempt to engage men about reframing the idea of man up, so that it doesn't just mean like toughen up, don't be such a girl. You've heard those kinds of terms before. To allow men and boys a wider range of possibilities for masculinity, instead of this one form of the gender binary. And this will potentially disrupt sexism as well. So that's what men can do. It's of course we want to listen to victims of sexual assault, but what is probably necessary to go along with that is to disrupt the binary in general. So let's go back to this idea of what's missing. When we do activities that try to help us to see sexism in its various forms, and sexual assault is one of them, what's missing when we have charts like this? When we have men on one side and women on the other, and we you felt already kind of the way that pits men against women. What's missing? Who's missing from this conversation? Yeah, Robin is talking in the chat. It's trans peoples, queer peoples. They're missing from that conversation, and that's a problem. So it's important for us to disrupt the binary, not only so that we can disrupt sexism, but so that we can include all peoples and all forms of gender expression. So it's good to ask questions like, is this sexist? Is this part of structural racism? Or is saying like, no, that's sexism, a form or an excuse of that is like a common rebuttal? We could also ask questions like, well, she's just a feminist, so we don't really have to pay attention to that, maybe. Or when people call Trudeau a feminist or a fake feminist, you can think about feminism as a way to disrupt the gender binary, not just as its historical, one-sided kind of understanding. So just give you, just to close tonight, a really brief history of feminism. It began with the suffrage movement, so having voting rights for white women, and to have women, white women in particular, be seen as persons under the law. So this was sort of in the early 1900s with voting rights happening just for white women to begin. And then later on in the later half of the 20th century, women of color were also included in that movement. And so then we see later on a second wave, which is often thought to be more radical in the 60s and 70s, related to women's rights, workforce, and bodies, and violence against women. So these are civil rights movements, and you might have heard the common sense idea like feminists are bra burners, or they don't shave their legs. That's where those ideas come from, is the second wave. And feminism is not just those things. There's also a third wave of feminism, which questions the category of women as something that is common to everyone, and also reminds us that there is intersections in our subject positions. So it's not just a taking up of women from a white woman perspective. It's a reimagining of what is assumed to be natural or normal about women in the gender binary, and that this is unchangeable. Often the third and fourth wave are sort of considered to be academic endeavors, but I really believe that these pieces need not just be academic problems. So you can ask yourself, man or woman, or gender neutral, or gender fluid, or queer, if you identify as a feminist. Men can be feminists. There's no one saying that men can't be feminists. And part of being a feminist as a man is attempting to disrupt hypermasculinity. So there are a couple of tasks for you to do before next week. And one of them is to watch this video, Gender Representations in Ads, which is kind of an example of a Mythbusters project, even though it wasn't framed in that way. These are students from the U of S from a couple of years ago. This was an assignment as for one of their courses in Women and Gender Studies. And so this might help you think about creativity in your Mythbusters assignment. Also, I want you to think about movies, and if particular, let's focus on gender in Disney, because it's really easy to think about how these stories reproduce the gender binary with kids. I want you to think about if gender in Disney or Disney movies in particular pass this Bechdel test? Does your movie have at least 2 female characters? Do they talk to each other? And do they talk about something other than a man? So there is in the weekly plans a chart that I want you to add at least 1 movie to and a little bit of explanation, and we'll talk about it next week. Looks like that. Are there any questions?
I have a question for the sign up that we signed up for. I signed up for the gender for our self-analysis, and you mentioned earlier in class how like we should talk about it more as masculine and feminine, right?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm so I didn't say stereotypical male or female.
Yeah, don't use terms male or female unless you're talking about biological sex. Very
Thank
good
you.
summary. Okay, so I will stop the recording and have a great week, everyone. If you have further questions, just stay on and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. See you next week.